ideas and my vision that's articulated in this memoir. I'm going to start standing up, but I have a bad back, so please forgive me if I sit down during this presentation. I'm going to begin with my argument, my thesis, for lack of a better word. What is the book trying to say? What is the glue that holds the whole volume together? And I'll try to lay that out as clearly as I can. And then secondly, it's not just an argument. It's not just a book that is an intellectual exercise of ideas. This is a memoir. It's a personal story. So after the argument, I want to talk a little bit about not how the book is written, but what's inside the book. How did it come together? What is a memoir? As a writer, what was I trying to do when I wrote it? Was I trying to do a critical examination of Pushkin and present it to a scholarly audience for discussion and examination? No. So I'll look at the design, the literary aspects, how the book is it an autobiography? Is it a slave narrative? Just what's inside the book. And then finally, I'd like to read a couple of passages so you get a sense of what the book sounds like. You might say the voice that's inside the book, not what I'm just saying up here on the stage. So the argument. I'd like to begin by citing, Richard Wright, the African-American novelist. He wrote a very interesting essay called The Literature of the Negro in the United States, published in France in 1948. The essay caught my eye because he talks about Pushkin in that essay. Of course, the essay is really his sense of definition. He tries to define what African-American literature is or what it has been historically. It's an amazing essay. But I'm going to just cite a few passages. He cites Alexander Dumas and Alexander Pushkin, and also Phyllis Wheatley. And what do all three of those names mean to him? Well, he begins with Alexander Dumas, and he quotes a passage from The Count of Monte Cristo. And then he asks the question, under USA racial mores, Dumas would have been classified as a quote-unquote Negro. And yet, when you read this passage, does this sound like a Negro? And what's Wright's answer? He says no. And so he begins to articulate the idea, though Dumas was a great writer, though he had, an African heritage, an African past, he was not really a quote-unquote Negro writer. He was integrated in the culture of France. He was a Frenchman. He does not have the bitter anger and frustration that emerges in African-American literature. In that sense, he dismisses Dumas. Then he turns to Pushkin, and he takes a passage from one of Pushkin's short stories, The Shot, in which two Russians are fighting a duel. And he says, does this sound like black folk culture? Two Russians engaged in a duel? And he says, no. And of course, he extends his argument from Dumas to Pushkin, saying that Pushkin does not have the bitter anger and frustration of US blacks, that Pushkin is at one with the Russian culture, that he was accepted in Russian society. And the end result is that Pushkin is actually a Russian. He is not part of the African tradition. And he says, finally, has any American Negro ever written like Dumas and Pushkin? And then he cites one particular writer. Guess who that is? Yes, Phyllis Wheatley. And he says that she shows almost no traces of being Negro or born in Africa. Of course, I would disagree with that if you look at Robert Hayden's poem, A Letter from Phyllis Wheatley. Very good poem. He shows emotionally how Phyllis Wheatley felt uncomfortable by being black in America and, you know, having to say things that she didn't really want to say. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's begin there, and then I'm going to shift to the editor of Black Scholar. He wrote to me back in 1998. I sent him an essay on Pushkin's African identity, and he rejected it, this particular editor. He says, "We are not able to use your essay. Black Scholar addresses personages and issues for whom black consciousness is of paramount importance. Pushkin, like Dumas' blackness was not his defining subject, nor does it seem to be of major existential significance to him." And so there's more to the letter. I'm paraphrasing for lack of time. Finally, I'm going to quote from J. Thomas Shaw. He's got an essay called Pushkin on His African Heritage. Shaw is a significant scholar. He published one of the first USA studies on Pushkin's African identity in 1993. So he's significant. He says, there is nothing to indicate Pushkin's having an African identity that hindered his acceptance as a Russian man of letters. He's saying the same thing that Wright is saying. Nothing hindered his acceptance. He had, you know, all the support that he needed to become a famous writer in Russia. Nothing hindered him. There were no roadblocks. He was a Russian. He had everything that he wanted and more so. Then he also says, there is nothing to indicate his black ancestry hindered his acceptance in Russian society. So he's saying two things. There's nothing that hindered his acceptance as a man of letters, as an artist. He's also saying there's nothing that hindered his acceptance in Russian society, which is different from, you know, being a man of letters, quote unquote. And there's where I disagree. If you take the word society to mean social society, I'm going to show, or at least make an attempt to show, there was a great deal of hindrance for Alexander Pushkin that's left out of the statement. So I'm going to begin my argument to refute these claims. And I'm going to begin, one more quote, please bear with me, by Professor. He published a biography in 1937 called Pushkin. Now you might say, why are we quoting from a 1937 source? That's dated by now. I'm quoting Simmons because in 37, for him to say this was way out of his league. Nobody was saying this in the established academic circles in 1937. And they're still not saying this today. And I'm going to kick off my argument through this. It would be profitable to dismiss the whole question of Negro blood, but Pushkin prevents this. If he had written his own bio, he would have developed considerable space to the subject. Pushkin took his African ancestry seriously. He thought and dreamed about the black founder of his family seriously and traced his physical appearance to him. Pushkin's so-called Negro ancestry had a deep psychological influence on him. And one last quote from Dieudonné Gnamankou, a French, African-French critic. He wrote an essay called Pushkin Between Africa and Russia. And his ideas come closest to my ideas. And I quote, Pushkin attached a great deal of importance to the African branch of his family. And this is very key here. African subjects are present in the poet's work in all phases from high school to his maturity. And just let me linger on that point for a moment, because since I first read Richard Wright's essay many, many years ago, I have been fortunate to do a great deal of research to uncover evidence that Wright was unable to uncover, and to go to Russia and to observe firsthand, many times, Russian people, Russian culture, their views and attitudes about Pushkin. And also to read Pushkin. Now, my Russian is not that good. It's good enough to do some translating and to corroborate English translations to make sure that they are correct to his 17-volume collected works. But I am not fluent in Russian, but I do know enough Russian to say that those English translations are correct or not correct. What am I saying? I'm saying that throughout Pushkin's work, where he talks about Russian people who are not African, you see definite traces of his African consciousness throughout his work. For instance, Eugene Onegin, his great work that he wrote between 1823 to 1831 about a Russian rake or playboy who feels alienated by his own society, his aristocratic society. And in chapter 1, paragraph 50, or stanza 50, the author cites his desire to return to Africa. The whole story is about a Russian who feels uncomfortable, alienated by his own society. And what's my point? Pushkin himself felt uncomfortable and alienated by his own society for political reasons and for racial reasons. Now, if people say, oh, he's at one with his culture, he's a Russian, okay? And he's accepted as a Russian. That's just nonsense. I hate to say that because I don't want to use that word with Richard Wright. I think his ideas are very important. But if you look at Pushkin's life, being Russian itself is problematic to say, oh, he's a Russian, therefore he's accepted. He was not accepted. Take the racial aspect away. He was in political trouble his entire life. He was sent into exile. His own class background, the boyars, were being declassed, and he was fighting a running battle since he was a teenager all the way up until his death. With his so-called Russian society wherein he was accepted. He was not accepted. He fought tooth and nail politically from sunup to sundown. That's just the politics. Then on the racial side, you know, I, in my research, uncovered dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of references, passages in his notebooks, in his doodles that he wrote. You know, he was a sketch artist where he would draw self-portraits of himself with elongated African stereotype features. You can see that he is sort of obsessed with this idea of African physical features. That's articulated in his notebooks. In the poems that are not published, he's got a large number of works, you know, that he never finished, that are still in notebooks. And the racial aspects of his life keep coming forward in huge amounts. So, let me reiterate. He was not at one with his culture for racial and political reasons. His writings do carry some bitterness and frustrations. And I would like to add, those bitterness and frustrations have some similarities with US blacks. And that's one of my ideas that I'm trying to express in this book. Perhaps the only real original idea in this book is that Pushkin's African identity, his African race consciousness, has similar parallels to African American people. And I don't mean just intellectuals, though that's very important. I say that because a lot of what I'm saying about Pushkin's racial identity, you could almost say it's a cliche. It's a cliche to say now, oh, Pushkin had race pride. Everybody's saying that now. Dozens and dozens of books have been written by a lot of people talking about Pushkin's African heritage, his racial identity. You know, this has been going on at least, well, in terms of America, since the Harlem Renaissance. You know, Opportunity magazine, Crisis magazine had articles coming out about Pushkin's African identity, and they were saying more or less the same things that I am saying. And even now, where Richard Wright's point of view still dominates. When I'm saying he has some kind of connection to African American consciousness, reality, culture, that's the minority point of view. Wright's point of view is still the majority point of view. I'm also saying there's some bitterness, frustrations. Russian was his defining subject, but African identity was still a major existential significance. And indeed, there is some psychological distance between himself, his culture, and his, Russian people. Okay, so that's the basic argument. I'm going to take that argument one step further to sort of nail down what I'm really trying to say. And that is, number one, he had African race, identity, and pride based on being descended from African people. What does that mean specifically? That sounds sort of floating in the air. Let's anchor that down. Where do we see his pride and his heritage? Where do we see, his connection to African people? The primary link for that is his great-grandfather, Abraham Petrovich Hannibal, or Gannibal in Russian. Does anyone know anything about Gannibal or Hannibal, his background, who he was? His great-grandfather was an African, captured by, I believe, Turkish Muslims around 1696. Either captured and sold, or sold before captured, and sent to, what's the capital of Turkey at the time? Turkey, Constantinople, what was the name? Istanbul, I think that, but that was, Istanbul was before Constantinople, correct? Well, anyway, he was sent to Turkey when the Ottoman Empire was ruling the world at that time, and had a huge trade going on, slave trade going on, at least since the 9th century, and it predates Atlantic slave trade. That's how Pushkin's great-grandfather came to Russia. He was a slave. He came from Africa. Now, where from Africa does he come? Because it's interesting how when people talk about, oh, he came from Africa, sometimes that discussion stops there because, well, what do you mean Africa? You know, Africa's big. Africa has many ethnic groups. You know, what part of Africa, you know? And that question sometimes is not discussed or answered. But there's a big debate there now. Did he come from Abyssinia? Did he come from Ethiopia? You know, I have a good friend from Eritrea, and he told me that Pushkin came from Eritrea and that he has relatives in Eritrea that still talk about Pushkin. And that's significant because if you look at the other argument about Pushkin, they say, or some scholars say he came from Chad, near the Cameroon, in a city called Legon. But that's a big debate. There's a lot of racial politics involved in that debate. But what's my point? My point is that Pushkin's great-grandfather came from Africa. Pushkin knew that. He is proud of it. He spends his life trying to discover and understand who his great-grandfather was and to understand Africa through that link. You know, he does so without any sense of hesitation. You know, Langston Hughes wrote a very famous essay called The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, where he says, for U.S. blacks, the racial mountain is accepting who you are, trying to write as a black writer and not trying to write as someone who is a white writer and disavowing your own racial heritage. Pushkin never had that. He never made any attempts to disavow who he was, where he came from. And even when he talked about his background, his race, his grandfather, he didn't use the word Arab. He used the word Arab, which means in Russian, black or Negro. That's how he defined himself. There was never an attempt to dismiss or to downplay or to try and pass in his life. So there's where you see the pride, or some of the pride. Let me just cite one passage from his work. Eugene Onegin, he has that famous stanza in chapter 1. It's time. Freedom hears my hail. It's time to drop the dull shores of my disfavor. And there beneath our noonday sun, my Africa, where waves break high to mourn for Russia. This is a very famous passage that a lot of people quote. It's showing his pride, his African race identity and pride, that when he writes this passage, Pushkin is in exile in Odessa. And he is in dismay over his own homeland, in dismay with Russia, with the Russian government, with the Russian Tsar, who threw him into exile. And in the midst of this, he is saying, I want to go home to Africa. I don't like being where I am now. I want to return to my homeland where, in a romantic sense, I'm going to find peace, where I'm going to find happiness. Notice that it's a backward look. It's a look into the past. But I'm quoting that passage to show in his primary work, again, he is articulating his pride in being descended from African people. But that proudness, you want evidence, is better seen when he cites that passage in Eugene Onegin. He includes a footnote. And the footnote runs about a page and a half. It's the largest footnote in the entire work. And he says, the author on his mother's side is of African descent. And he gives Gannibal's biography in the middle of Eugene Onegin, a story that has no African characters in it except for the author. A full biography, where he came from in Africa, his accomplishments. It's not just that Gannibal came from Africa. Gannibal, or Hannibal, was the most distinguished black person, African person in Europe and Russia in that entire era, in the 18th century. He was extremely distinguished. He rose from slavery to become a full general in the Russian army. He was a military engineer. He built most of the fortifications in Russia at the time, from the Mongolian border to Estonia. He was a mathematician. He was fluent in at least 3 languages. He was a very accomplished individual. And of course, Pushkin brings that out. There's his pride. You know, my African ancestor did all these things, and he was African. And that's something to be proud of. And that's in the footnote, a work that has nothing to do with African people, supposedly. So there are other examples. I'm going to speed this up a little bit. He has an unpublished poem where he says, in the countryside, my great-grandfather, my Negro great-grandfather, hid under the canopy of lime blossoms. He thought in cool summers about his distant Africa, I wait for you. There's another example. He says that his grandfather, to escape court intrigue at the time, you know, he was hiding to escape from that. Sitting under these lime trees, I guess. And what does he think about? He thinks about Africa. I think of you. Again, this is another piece of evidence, another citation of his African race pride. Finally, let's go on. The second part of his race pride, and I think this may be a little bit more original, is that Pushkin is critical towards ideas that view black people as socially or intellectually inferior. It's not that he's just proud because he's descended from an African who was accomplished, but he actually stood up and fought against racists in Russia, and there were racists in Russia, and there still are, who despised him and attacked him. That's what Richard Wright didn't see. Pushkin was the object or subject of racial attack on numerous occasions. And let me say that a little bit about racism in Russia at the time. To say that he's Russian, and by being Russian, they accepted him is not true, because among the aristocratic class from which he came, they had taken their racist views from the 18th century or 17th century European Enlightenment. I need not go into it because I think most people know. If you see the encyclopedia, published by Denis Diderot and some of the works of Voltaire, you know, there were different views about race, but one of the underlying agreements in 18th century views of African people was that they were intellectually inferior. You see that time and time and time and time again. That's what Pushkin had to deal with. And I'll give one example. It's called the Bulgarian incident towards the end of his life. Feyadi Bulgarian wrote an anecdote, published it in a journal, and said, why does this Pushkin talk about his African ancestry? You know, why is he proud of being an African? Doesn't everybody know that he, you know, his great-grandfather was a slave and that he was bought from the Turks by a sailor for a bottle of rum? He really just, you know, Bulgarian really disparaged Pushkin, basically saying that your great-grandfather was nothing. He was nothing but a slave. And he published this in a major journal. And then Pushkin wrote his very famous poem, My Genealogy, and he says, my great-grandfather didn't peddle pancakes, didn't shine the boots of the Tsar, nor was he a deserter who abandoned the Austrian powder regiments. This blackamoor grew up zealous, incorruptible, the Tsar's confidant, and not a slave. My Genealogy is a very well-known poem, and he circulated it through, you know, the reading public in Russia among his friends. It got back to the Tsar. The Tsar said, I will not allow you to publish this in any Russian journal, which that's what happened. He couldn't publish it. And Pushkin had to respond because the Tsar said, you shouldn't have written that. And Pushkin says, about a year ago, one of our journals printed a satirical essay in which a certain mulatto man of letters had been bought by a sailor for a bottle of rum. I was the one referred to, since no Russian writer besides me has Negro ancestors. I take pride in myself and my ancestors, since it is the only heritage they have left me. And he responded to Bulgarian. He attacked him back. Why this is important is this incident, I can't prove this, but I'm going to say it, eventually led to his death. Because Bulgarian, you know, didn't write that letter on his own. He was inspired, I mean, that critique of you know, Pushkin's African ancestors. He was inspired to write that anecdote, let's say it's an anecdote, by a man named, I think, Ushakov, who was the Minister of Public Education. And he egged Bulgarian on to publish that particular piece. Bulgarian was connected and hooked up with a clique of Russian nobles who were very close to the Tsar, and they hated Pushkin. And many of them had racist views about African people. And they expressed those views in a number of ways. Anonymous letters to Pushkin, okay? They went out of their way to attack Pushkin. Eventually, one of the members of this clique, George Dantes, was an individual who courted Pushkin's wife openly in front of everybody. And it is my view that this clique, this is not an original idea. Others have this idea as well besides me. But this clique was doing everything it could to destroy Pushkin and eventually to kill him, because Pushkin did die in a duel to George Dantes. And nobody talks about it in racial terms, but I think it's there. And it's another piece of evidence to show contrariwise to Richard Wright, that Pushkin was not at one with Russian people, that there is some frustration and anger in his relationship to various individuals in Russia, that he had to face racism. He was not just a Russian man like everybody else, you see. And there are other pieces of evidence. I've got stuff on my list here that I'm skipping because of time, but the evidence is overwhelming. All right, moving on. There's one final aspect to Pushkin's African identity, African race consciousness, his pride. And I have to mention this before I turn to the book. There is one aspect of Pushkin's consciousness that's in contradiction to his race pride, and that is he does have paradoxical feelings about self-hatred based on his physical appearance. He did not take pride sometimes in his African features. His African features stood out, and when you look at the commentaries of his contemporaries, their memoirs, their letters, they talk about how he looks African. And they don't just talk about it, but they usually articulate his looks to some form of stereotype that they disparage. And that disparaged stereotype is to suggest that he is African looking, therefore he is ugly. Remember, among aristocratic society, African features were considered ugly. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest that was the predominant and dominating view. And that had an effect on Pushkin. He had to face that, and he didn't just stand up and say, oh no, I'm an African, I'm proud of it, and so forth. He had to face slurs, racist comments, calling him Othello, and calling him a monkey, calling him, he had African passion, all the stereotypes that we see today, Pushkin had to face. When he was in high school with his contemporaries, he had to face those criticisms. And when he got older, as we see in the Bulgarian incident. And now I'm going to add another thing to the mix. This especially came out when he started to think about getting married. Here's where we see the idea of social acceptance was not there at all. In numerous letters, poems, he talks about basically his inability to attract a so-called beautiful Russian woman. He had this complex about how difficult it would be, to marry a Russian woman. They would not accept him, and he was kind of right. There are letters from women of high society who talked about Pushkin's ugly African profile. He is not handsome in the way that, Caucasians are handsome, in that milieu. I give you one piece of evidence in this story called The Negro of Peter the Great. It's the story of his African grandfather, once again, that Pushkin expressed or wrote about his great-grandfather's struggle to find a wife, his struggles to relate to European women, and his feelings of inferiority when he did so. And he has this character called Korsakov, who is a kind of Iago. Pushkin created Korsakov as an Iago figure from Shakespeare's Othello. And Korsakov says to Ibrahim, now Abraham becomes Ibrahim, he tells him, don't marry. If you want my opinion, Your betrothed can't stand the sight of you. Not you with your brooding and suspicious nature, with your flat nose, your thick nips, your rough woolly head. It would be crazy for you to hurt yourself or to hurl yourself into the perils of marriage. Now, he puts that passage into the short story about his great-grandfather. But you know, it's not about his great-grandfather he's writing about himself. Pushkin, in his letters, as I said, is afraid that, first of all, he's not going to get married because nobody is going to take him. And then when he finally finds a woman who is so-called beautiful in Russian terms, and she agrees to marry him, he is beside himself. And he says, well, I know I'll never be good enough for her to fall in love with me. Even if she just marries me and stays loyal to me, I'll accept that. He doesn't even believe, even after he marries her, that she really even loves him. What is my point? My point is that, especially around the issue of dating and marriage, Pushkin was very insecure. And those insecurities are expressed in his work. Of course, if you've read, who wrote Black Skins, White Masks? Frantz Fanon. If you read Frantz Fanon, Fanon would have a field day with Pushkin on that subject, because Pushkin is everything that Fanon says about the colonized and the colonizer, and, you know, black man, white woman, black man, that fits Pushkin perfectly. And this is before Fanon even was born that we see those kinds of motifs emerging. One last point, and then I'll finish. Pushkin's African consciousness is similar to African Americans in this, the alien and exile theme, where, let's just go back to Africa for a moment. The passages that I quoted from Pushkin where he talks about Africa, very similar, very close to what the Harlem Renaissance writers were writing in the 1920s. You know, County Cullen, Langston Hughes. You know, Africa is this beautiful sun-drenched place where we can escape to, where we'll find peace, where we'll find paradise. It's a romantic escape. And just a couple of lines. You know, County Cullen, what is Africa to me? Copper sun or scarlet sea, jungle star or jungle track, da-da-da, what is Africa to me? Langston Hughes, I am Negro, black as the night is black, black like the depths of my Africa. Langston Hughes, African-American fragment. So long, so far away is Africa. Subdued and time lost are the drums, and yet there comes this song I do not understand. Hughes, I've known rivers, ancient rivers of the world, older than the flow of human blood. I built my hut near the Congo. I looked upon the Nile and raised pyramids. You can go on and on and on and on and on. But what am I saying? I'm saying that those echoes of Africa that we see in the Harlem Renaissance poets almost perfectly fit what Pushkin is articulating, though I would argue that if you look at the Harlem Renaissance poets, their understanding of Africa itself is a little bit more in depth. And they also express, the Harlem Renaissance poets, some discomfort. Yeah, I'm proud to be African. I am an African. But County Cullen, at the end of his poem, says, you know, he almost goes insane. I'm pulled by Africa, but I'm also pulled by Western society. And I belong to Jesus Christ. We don't see that kind of articulation in Pushkin. One last point, and Langston Hughes wrote an essay called Negroes in Moscow in 1933. This corroborates my thesis that Pushkin has a connection to Black American consciousness. Hughes says, recently in my tour in the South, I saw pictures of Pushkin in many schools and colleges in the American Black Belt. This is in 1933. I heard colored teachers in Mississippi and Georgia point to him as an inspiration. So that's significant. And I've heard that before, that in the Deep South, in the churches, in the schools, Pushkin historically has a presence. Okay? Many people don't know that. Where does that presence come from? Why would somebody in a black church in Mississippi hang a portrait of Pushkin in the church unless there's some connection there? Are they doing it just to, say, oh, we're connected to Pushkin? No, they obviously must know something about him, and they feel some connection to him. And I look at Paul Robeson in his speeches. He doesn't talk about Pushkin, well, he does talk about Pushkin directly, but he also talks about how when he sings, quote-unquote, Negro spirituals, he feels a connection to Russian folk songs. And he can also sing Russian folk songs in Russian, you see. So there is some connection between Pushkin and African-American culture, and there is some connection also between African-American culture and Russian culture based upon the history of serfdom and slavery. That's another story, but I'm going to throw that out there too, to show that there is a connection. And that hopefully that corroborates my thesis. So where are we in terms of time? I know you guys want to ask questions. 7:30? Okay. I have other things to say, but we're moving along here. I'd like to read just a couple passages. Was that good? Would that be from the book itself? Okay. And then we can open up to discussion. This is in the introduction. I first heard of Alexander Pushkin in 1972 when my parents gave me a biography of him written by Henri Troyat. I had just graduated from Lincoln University in Oxford, Pennsylvania, and wanted to be a poet and writer. To be sure, I had heard of Pushkin before then as a student and English major, but more so through my familiarity with the Harlem Renaissance and African-American literature. Troyat's book was big, thick, and comprehensive. One of Pushkin's portraits inside the pages was an engraving made by E. Heitman, showing him as a mixed-race young man. Since he looked like some of the students at Lincoln, I considered him to be black. Keep in mind, this was during a time when racial identity in the US was defined in terms of black and white categories, a time when Malcolm X called for the separation of races, and even after his death when his influence grew. Nikki Giovanni, Amiri Baraka, Sonia Sanchez all gave speeches to the Lincoln student body. Amilcar Cabral, the African freedom fighter from Guinea-Bissau, also gave a speech just before his assassination in 1973. Students and leaders from African liberation movements were prominent and celebrated, including Kwame Nkrumah, a Lincoln University alumnus. So that's how the book opens up. Let's move forward. Okay, I think this is important. So when I considered Pushkin to be black, I saw him as someone like me and looked up to him as a role model at a time when I desperately needed such examples to keep me inspired. I desperately needed to see writers who were quote-unquote black in USA terms and had accomplished high literary achievement. If Pushkin could do it, maybe there was hope I could too. Like countless others, I had appropriated Pushkin to fit an image I could understand without trying to know him in relation to his background and identity as a Russian. Pushkin had become an African American who reflected more of my own biases, psychological needs, and necessities. I'm going to go further because the point of a memoir, you can't just talk about yourself. You've got to talk about yourself in honest terms. It's got to be personal. One of these needs was to see Pushkin as a male who demonstrated courage and bravery. The countless duels he fought to defend his honor during his life are now legendary. I too wished I had these qualities when I knew I did not. Even though I grew up with a father, an Army veteran of World War II, whose fearlessness was in every way equal to Pushkin's. He constantly pushed these traits on me and my two brothers, and yet my inner secret as a boy was my fear, cowardice, and inability to measure up. Separately from my father, I needed Pushkin's example to help me find my manhood. This was part of my pursuit, part of my journey. I cite that passage because that was difficult to write, to bring the Pushkin argument down to a personal emotion. Pushkin for me was also a part of myself related to Pushkin because I had something to prove. I had to show myself that I didn't have fear, I didn't have cowardice. That's one of the reasons why I kept going back to Russia 10, 11, 12 times, because when I went to Russia, lo and behold, it comes out in the book. I ran into the skinhead movement back in early 2000s. The neo-Nazis were everywhere. And two of them assaulted me once. I had to see them in coffee shops, on the street. I had to, find ways to avoid them, otherwise I'd be attacked. This was a time when Africans and Asians were being beaten and killed throughout Russia. It was a horrible time to be in Russia at that time. And so I kept going back, not just merely to discover Pushkin and to figure out who Pushkin was and how he emerged from this society, which was important, to go into the archives and to read the primary sources. But I had to go back to prove to myself that I wasn't going to let these neo-Nazis, run me away, run me into the ground. I had to go back and face them. I went back to the same town where these neo-Nazis were, to prove to myself that I didn't have fear and I didn't have cowardice. And that comes out in the book. So this book is not just about Pushkin, this book is also about me and my need to claim some semblance of manhood, which, as I articulate in the book, at some point, after many years, that became less and less important. I didn't have to face that issue anymore. Because basically, I had to accept myself. And by the time that I was going back after 10, 11, 12 times, that neo-Nazi movement had more or less died down. The same individuals that I saw in the streets of Skov were no longer there. The authorities had put them into summer camps, and they were gone. So I didn't have to face that. I could go back to Russia, and I didn't have to face that like I did 7, 8 years earlier. So I had to bring that out. One word, I have to mention this. In the book, I talk about I got involved in a Alexander Pushkin filmmaking project. The book is about myself, but also about others, people that I met. And I began to work with other people who were also interested in Pushkin. And one of one person was Barney McSwine. I have a chapter about him. And we got together and decided to write a Pushkin screenplay, Ode to Freedom, based upon Pushkin's life. We sat down and we wrote a screenplay because we thought this would make an excellent movie. And I articulate that whole experience of writing the screenplay, trying to shop it around, quote unquote, Hollywood to get it made and done, entering film, screenwriting contests, sending letters to rich and famous people to see if they would support an Alexander Pushkin movie, Condoleezza Rice, Oprah, Bill Cosby. We did everything we could to make an Alexander Pushkin movie. And that comes out in the book. It's a major part of the book. To make a long story short, all those efforts failed. It wasn't just me and my friends, but Harry Belafonte. He tried to make a Pushkin movie, didn't go anywhere. And of course, the famous case is Quincy Jones. Quincy Jones had the money. He had the film crew. They went to Russia, and somebody pulled the plug. By the way, Quincy Jones wanted Michael Jackson to play the lead for Alexander Pushkin. What's my point? My point is that it was a valuable experience to write the screenplay, to try and get this movie made. But I also learned about, what am I learning? What am I learning? I'm learning about how getting a Pushkin movie made is nearly impossible. There are racial barriers and political barriers. First, because there are racial and political barriers against doing anything that involves Russia, especially in Hollywood. To this day, I don't know of any movie or documentary that's been done based on Alexander Pushkin's life, though there have been many people who have tried. Something is wrong here. What's the problem? Okay? One of the problems is that, and this is something I had to face, it's a hard sell to present Pushkin to an American audience, and even to a Black American audience. Pushkin is not well known. I taught a Pushkin class at GW back in George Washington University back in 2014. Most of the students in that class were foreign students, no African American students at all. I had a difficult time getting African American students to take Pushkin seriously, to get them into my classes. My point being that for some reason, Pushkin remains an outsider. Pushkin is not, despite his popularity in the Harlem Renaissance and among artists and intellectuals, he is not really accepted. And if you want to do anything with him, it's an uphill battle. It's an uphill climb. I mean, you have John Killins's novel, Great Black Russian. You know, you have some works about Pushkin, but I'm sure that his novel really didn't sell very well, okay? Pushkin is not a household name, and a lot of Americans and black Americans are just not interested in him. They know who he is, and if they know him, they may know about his personality, but lo and behold, they've never read anything about him, none of his poems, none of his stories. So my point is that this attempt to pursue Pushkin has been an uphill battle that continues. Let me just read one more passage, and then we'll finish and open up to questions. I'm going to read my last piece here about, you know, I've been pursuing Pushkin through various projects for 40 years. And then that all came to an end in 2019. From 2019 to 2020, like everyone else, I spent most of those months shuttered in place, unable to travel or do proper research in archives, schools, and libraries. The COVID scare began to wind down sometime in late 2021. By then, the uproar of George Floyd had also quieted. For a brief time, I went back to some of the sources. Alison Blakely, the great scholar on black people in Russia, the sources that Blakely had given me in hopes I might get back to Pushkin. I'm trying to get back to Pushkin. I'm trying to continue this work. I even started to retake Russian language classes, but all this fell short in 2022. The Russo-Ukrainian War erupted, and I was back to square one. Everything came to a screeching stop. At the end of the book, I talk about how this Pushkin work, this was before I actually started writing my book, came to an end. And when I started to write this book, it was going to be a book about, a retrospective book about, oh, those are the Pushkin years. I'm beyond that now. Everything came to an end. The Russian-Ukrainian wars began. That killed any attempt or further attempt to write about Pushkin, to do a Pushkin movie, to do any kind of Pushkin work. And then in the process of writing this book, and I wrote this book, one of the reasons I wrote it was because of the Russo-Ukrainian War. I had an editor from a publisher who said, well, you know, a book on Pushkin might be wanted now because of this Russian-Ukrainian conflict. And so I began to write. If there was no Russian-Ukrainian conflict, I might not have written this book. Because I would have said to myself, what's the point? Nobody's going to read it. So I set about writing it. And I'm going to finish with one last short paragraph. So, I am calling for a change of approach to Pushkin, a change in myself from my earlier reasons for pursuing Pushkin study, no longer looking up to him to keep me inspired as a writer. The only inspiration I need is to keep writing no matter what. No longer traveling to Russia because I need to prove I'm not afraid to go. No longer needing Pushkin to define my manhood. No longer feeling guilty because Pushkin might not be accepted in the African American community. Now it is essential to make the case for Pushkin and to encourage opportunities for students of color to use him to advance their careers and their interests. Now, I believe, one can study Pushkin at the same time that one studies African and African American literature, or any other form of literature. Pushkin is not mutually exclusive. He's not an either-or concept. So I end the book not by a retrospective account saying, oh, those are my Pushkin years, and that's all over with. The book helped me to reimagine Pushkin and to say, this work must keep going. It's not over. Despite the war, we have to keep our interest and our focus on these Pushkin projects, and it will not die. That's how I really end the book. And so I think I'll end my little talk on that. And, thank you.
Coles. I'm sure folks have a lot of questions. I won't be greedy. I'm just going to ask a couple questions, and then we're going to hand the mic out for Q&A. My first question is, what was it about Pushkin's writing that made him this titanic figure in Russian culture and history? And did that have anything to do with the special perspective that his inside-outsider status within the aristocracy?
Good question. Yes. If you read Pushkin's work, why is Pushkin well known even in Russia? It's because he, the literature before Pushkin was a very aristocratic literature, very formal. What Pushkin did was he took that formality and turned his creative gaze on everyday, ordinary, individual Russian people, many of them serfs and peasants, okay? And he used their vocabulary, he used their points of view, he used them as characters. The captain's daughter, he's got a servant in that story who's a three-dimensional human being. Pushkin gave Russian people who were non-aristocratic, non-nobility, he gave them a presence in literature. That's why the Russians love him, is because he gave them a literature, he gave them characters, he gave them a voice that Russian literature had not had up to that point. So he really brought the Russian people into the Russian poetic imagination. And he's got a very good book out called The Pugachev Rebellion. He talks about a peasant revolt in the late 1700s where thousands of people were killed. And he goes to the region and he listens to the people who revolted and murdered hundreds, if not thousands, of, aristocrats, just like they did in France in the French Revolution. He is giving voice to people who don't have a voice, who are invisible, who are nobodies. And that's why I think you have to read his work to see that, but that's why I think he's well known.
Thank you. You mentioned your class, your Pushkin class that you taught at GW, and how initially no African American students signed up. You also mentioned Pushkin's popularity during the Harlem Renaissance. You came to know him during the Black Arts Movement. And you mentioned how there were posters of him or pictures of him up in schools and churches in the South as early as 1933. Why is it then, and given also the ways that the lines you've drawn to connect his experience to the African American experience, why don't we know him?
Good question. Well, I'll try to answer that. Maybe I can, but I still think he's on the margin of African American culture. Now, I know what Hughes said about the Deep South. That's what Hughes says. But in my experience, I don't see the evidence, okay? I haven't seen the evidence. I see the evidence with a few musicians, a few artists, a few academics who know of Pushkin, talk about him. But in terms of the African American community, I don't see that. I don't see the interest. I don't see the kind of interest that you saw in the Harlem Renaissance. And remember, the Harlem Renaissance came about because you had Marcus Garvey talking about going back to Africa. So that was a unique time period in American history. You don't have a movement like that now. Here's the other thing I'll say, and maybe I'm wrong, but I'm going to say it. I think one of the big problems is Pushkin is still seen, he's still seen as someone in the way that Richard Wright saw him. I think people still, a lot of people still believe that he is a Russian. He's not an African American. He doesn't relate to me. His stories, his background, I can't relate to. I can't read his stories. I'm not interested. He's a Russian. I'm an African American. And I think Richard Wright, his opinion, to some degree, still holds. And I know I've been to conferences with people arguing against that point of view. Back in 1998, I was at the MLA convention, and the scholars were saying, you're wrong. Pushkin is Russian. He has nothing to do with African Americans. I was the only one saying that. Well, there was one other scholar who was supporting me, but everybody else was saying just the opposite of what I was saying. And the third reason, I think, why there's this disconnect, I think a lot of black Americans feel that the Russians are racist. I hear that a lot. Oh, Russian people are racist. They don't like Russian people because they see them as being racist. Pushkin notwithstanding. And so if Russian people are racists, then why should I read about Alexander Pushkin? I'm not going to be involved with reading about someone whose culture is a racist culture. I think some of that still lingers. Now, I could be wrong. I may be very wrong, but that is how I would answer your question.
Kind of on a related note, how do, you talked about your experience in Russia dealing with concrete racism. We do know that there is a, let's say at least a racist streak, a strong one in the Russian culture. How do modern day Russians wrestle with his Africanity, given that he's considered like the father of the Russian language? So if he's a cultural source for them, but then you have a society that has this, at least in the modern day, this very strong streak of racism, how do they square that circle?
Okay. Well, you can't talk about Russian people as one monolith. Yeah, you have neo-Nazis and racists, but you have other layers of Russian life too. And that's why I would say Russian people, yeah, there are racists, but there are also non-racists in Russia. And, they're the ones who support Pushkin. And that might be the majority of Russians who have that point of view. You see, so one thing about Russia I learned, I went there 12 times. I had different experiences, but I still feel that I've just scraped the surface. There's a lot about Russia, Russian people, Russian culture, Russian history that I just don't know. Even though I spent thousands of hours and did a lot of traveling. I never went to the Far East. I never went to Siberia. I never went to the Urals. I never went to the southern part down near Uzbekistan and so forth and so on. A lot of Americans, black or white, don't know very much about Russia, you see, and until you do, how can you make assertions about what Russian people or Russian culture is like, you see? One thing about Russia, I will say this, that I do know. When you talk to the average Russian, they, as a whole, do not see themselves as being a part of Europe with European consciousness and points of view. You talk to the average Russian and they'll say, we are not Europeans, okay? We are Russian. We don't think like Americans. We don't think like the British. We don't think like the French. And that feeds into the racial point of view, because they'll say, well, the kind of racism you see in Western Europe and the United States is not what we have in Russia. We are not Western European. We are not the United States. And they take a hard line on that. And you see that coming out in the current war. This war in Ukraine is a war against Russia and the West, of which they say they are not a part of. And I'll go further. A lot of them think that they have the same experience and the same consciousness that Africans had under colonialism. They'll come out and they'll say that. That's part of their articulation and argument, that we were colonized too, not just you, but us as well, you see. And that also feeds into the Russian culture.
Thank you. My last question before I relinquish the microphone. Did Pushkin ever meet or interact with any other African-descended people?
Good point. Yes. Morales, or Ali the Moor. Pushkin in 1823, 1824 was sent into exile into Odessa. And while he was in Odessa, he met an African from Egypt called Ali. And according to Liprandi, who wrote a memoir about Pushkin, and I've seen this in a number of sources, Pushkin and Ali were very tight, very close. And Pushkin was happiest when he was around Ali. Not only that, but, Liprandi says that Pushkin once told him, perhaps there's a bond between me and you, between me, Pushkin, and you, Ali. And he said, maybe my great-grandfather knew some of your relatives. So he actually presented Ali with that understanding that they might be related. I hesitate to see what they really talk about that Liprandi didn't record. There must have been a very interesting discussion about race, about Africa, that has not been recorded. That's just one example.
Thank you, sir. What questions do we have?
Thank you so much. And I wish your view came out during Killen's book on Pushkin. I wish you were there also, because I think you have excavated a lot of important sociological, psychological informations that truly explains Pushkin, in my view. Impulsively, I knew he was battling racism. What does that go on to mean? I knew he was battling racism by the fact that he was in so many duels he had to face that ultimately kills him as well. So for me, I think in the 1960s and 70s, there was that kind of research of his rebellious, oppressed status that even put him, in the affinity of identifying with the serfs is very important to the Russian Revolution itself. Mm-hmm. And the Russian revolutionaries, he is the invoker, inciter of the actual revolution. In fact, you can correct me later because I want to come back at a few things more important. In fact, it's said his group, the literary group he belonged to, used to wear red scarves as a fashion of rebellion against the Tsar planet. And the Russian Revolution, the working class flag, red flag, comes out of Pushkin, is said. The other thing I really want to come back to is I think, to me, now, I'm not surprised that you're having the problem of African young people, in taking a class like Pushkin, because I think even Toussaint Louverture would not be successful now, or Malcolm X's class is not successful now, because I feel there is a poverty of the intellectual dimension in the country in general. And I think I would say the kind of work you're doing can resurrect the different dynamics if a generation is going to enter the scene. We don't know yet. I mean, up to now, I'm not sure we have a rebellion generation yet, in my view. All the Black Lives Matters considered, I don't think outside the fashion show, outside the manipulation of capitalism and materialism, I'm not seeing the kind of youth that should come to grab the Pushkin, the Toussaint Louverture, etc. So for me, I think the time you're talking about Pushkin's poster existing in the southern United States, that's a highly rebellious people expressing their connection. Toussaint was also up there in Cuba. It's found, Toussaint Louverture found under, his posters are found wherever there was rebellion, 1812, etc., or something. I might mess up the year. So I'm saying, do not lose. I just think there's a generation coming up, and that you have to write that part of his, crucible against racism of white supremacy, a Russian version, which is real. But again, black intellectuals are compromised when it comes to not criticizing Russia. If Russia is the enemy of white America, it's very hard sometimes for black people to really get into Russia racism. For me, this white supremacy in the Indo-European racism is real. I don't have fantasy about Russia. But the point I want to come at is for you to speak more, his confrontation, his, like for example, in the novel you mentioned, isn't there a baby in a
Yeah, Negro of Peter the Great.
Can you speak about that, for example? Because to me, and I think my wife is here, and I'm like, I forgot now even the title until you mentioned it. But the baby was speaking for its mixed situation, isn't it? Or am I missing?
Yeah, the Negro of Peter the Great, it's the story of Pushkin's great-grandfather, which goes to your point that, Pushkin's talking about himself, but he's also talking about the racism that his great-grandfather faced. His great-grandfather was a student in 17th century France. He went there as to study mathematics and military engineering. And in the novel, which is unfinished, he is the only black student of merit who interacts with French aristocrats. And so they are all looking at, oh, there goes Hannibal. He's this very famous person because he's black and he's among them and he's educated and cultured. What happens is that he meets an aristocratic white woman and they get involved and have an affair. Cut to the chase is that she becomes pregnant, and she's also married. And when the baby is born, Pushkin has the baby is interchanged, the black baby with a white baby, so the husband will not find out that she had this affair with this African student from Russia. That's just part of the story. After that affair, his great-grandfather, the character in the novel, leaves the woman and goes back to Russia. And he sends her a letter and says, you know, I am leaving you. Why am I leaving you? Because eventually you are going to leave me. Our relationship is fated to die. And basically what he's saying is there's no way, because you're white and I'm black, that we could really even fall in love, that there's no possibility that this relationship can survive. Not to mention what happened with the baby, the interchanging of the babies to deceive the husband, which he is very uncomfortable with. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. But I also want to ask you, I know you're going somewhere, but the other part of it, which I think is a universal African stereotype struggle, the continued exoticization of Pushkin by the Russian oligarchy, exoticizing him as a creature, of exotic creature from Africa. That aspect is also, I think, what is forgotten in terms of what is actually torching him into the
Yes.
rebellion, physical and intellectual and literary response to that.
You're quite right. I think, you know, Fanon had a comment about that as well, that idealizing an African person is just as bad as hating them. It's the same phenomenon on the same, a different side of the same coin. And basically what you're saying is this African is held up on a pedestal because he is so strange. But he doesn't like it because they don't see him as just being another person. Okay? I'm not an exotic figure. I'm a student. I'm here. I'm educated. I'm like you. Treat me like you. Don't say, oh, you're this noble savage that everybody wants to meet. You see. And Fanon has a whole analysis about that. So you're quite right. That exoticizing does happen. It happened to Pushkin, and Pushkin hated it. And of course, he shows in the story that his great-grandfather hated it too. But I just want to go back to a point you made earlier. You're right about education. One point I want to make is what we're seeing now in this society is the degree to which education itself in our entire society has been destroyed. You see it in the high schools. You see the kids going to high school and they're not learning anything. There is a conspiracy to keep real education out of our schools. I think it's for blacks and whites, but especially among blacks, there has been a deterioration in the mind. You're right. There are forces that want to destroy and kill any attempt to really learn and understand history, culture, things that really mean, things that really matter. Education itself is being destroyed. Now, who's doing it or why, I don't know. But you're quite right. That is what's going on now. And that was not the case for me in the 1960s and the 70s, where we had leaders, most of whom were killed, okay, who really pushed education, pushed the boundaries of the youth to learn about things, to read, to study, to learn about Africa, to learn about Russia, to learn about international affairs. That's all been destroyed in this generation. And how we bring that back to life, I don't know, but we have to, because it's going, Where it's going is not very good. The kids are not going anywhere. They're being destroyed, and that has to stop.
Any more questions?
Yeah, I have a question on the more on the current events aspects and the historical aspects too. The is there grounds, in just your own view and through your own work, is there grounds for African Americans or Black Americans to have a view of Russia that's different than the white American view? I mean, I think I know your answer, but I'd like to hear what you have to say about that in terms of the richness of the connections, some of which, you know, you've explored in your own work.
My short answer is I hope so, because that's the problem. You're getting a view of Russia that's really defined by the U.S. media. The U.S. media, even educated people plug into it. So their view of Russia and Russian peoples are coming from CBS, NBC, CNN. That's how they view Russia. So what we have to do is go around that predominant control of who Russians are and what Russia is, and learn about Russia on our own. I was fortunate because I went to Russia, and I could see it firsthand for myself. I think travel is a very important point. I would love to see African American people travel to Russia on their own and get their own perspective. It can be done, and it should be done. That's part of the education that's missing in the African American community is, you know, we're not encouraged to travel like that. You know, we're not supposed to leave the United States and get our own points of view. If you can go to Russia on your own or with a group, that's the first step, and one should take that step.
I was, I was reading the captain and his daughter, the story where the story of the Negro of Peter the Great. His grandfather in France, he was begged not to go back to savage Russia. I don't know if you
Yeah, I remember the passage, yes.
Yeah, all the ladies in France always wanted him to remain in France. So
Yeah,
the dichotomy of two European societies where they consider Russia as a savage.
that's a good point.
And as you may know, French was primarily the language of the elites in Russia, if you can talk about that. And also the African-American experience of the 1930s. There are African-Americans who were agricultural experts who went to Russia, you know? And there are contributions that were made by the African-Americans. I don't know
Yes, quite
to what
right.
extent their ancestors, I don't know if they're still in Russia or not.
Good point, that in the story of the Negro of Peter the Great, you know, Ibrahim doesn't want to return to Russia, back to Peter the Great. And the regent, I forget the regent's name, says, why go back to Russia? You know, Russia's a savage place, barbarians. We in France will treat you better. You'll be among civilized people. Which is a very interesting point, because that also corroborates the difference and separation between Russia and Europe. A lot of Europeans at that time, you see this in the memoirs, you see this in the books, their view of Russia, of Russian people, is that they are savages, they are barbarians. They are not one of us. And that goes back to the point where Russians say, well, we're not European. And I guess for Pushkin, you know, there's a double colonization. He's colonized because he's black from Africa, and then he's colonized because he's Russia in relationship to Europe, and Russians are considered to be savages like Africans. So that double process is there historically, and I'm glad you pointed it out. And you write about the 1930s, that one of the reasons why Pushkin became quite well known and famous, from 1917 to 1954, when the communists came to power, they latched on to Pushkin. And, Pushkin's work, he was the most publicized author of all the Russian writers. He was the most publicized author during the communist years. And why that's so is, you look at the communist leaders from Lenin, Stalin, Nekrasov, all the major leaders were writing essays and tracts about the oppression of the U.S. Negro, quote unquote. They've invited, black artists, black technicians, John Oliver Golden with the Tuskegee agricultural workers, 22 of them. They invited them to Russia. They gave a lot of attention to Black America from 1917 to 19, and that's something that should be mentioned, and I'm glad you cited that. Of course, that's not, after 54, that's another story, but for those years, there was a connection, direct connection between American blacks and Russia under the Soviet, not Russia, but Soviet dominance.
Thank you for this talk. It's really exciting. I'm sort of embarrassed to admit that I don't know much about Pushkin myself, and given your exploration here, I'll be studying more. But given your role and experience in academia and the ways in which people have failed to develop interest in Pushkin, given the approach that's been taken to date through literature, through books, things of that nature, I'm curious about how we can modernize the presentation of Pushkin to make it appeal to youth without watering it down. That's the first thing. And the second thing would be almost a question, but more of a statement. As I'm sitting here thinking about leaders like Ibrahim, Traore, and Paul Robeson, the role that Russia has played in helping, to your point, how the Communist Party, when they came to power, they were publishing about the oppression of the American Negro. There's a thread there, and I just feel like there's so much to discover, because you're right. We have a lot of prejudice through the media about Russia that tends to have us not, gravitate towards it more. So I'm just curious about just your thoughts on that more. Because it's really, when I think about especially what's happening in Mali and Niger with Al Qaeda and what Russia's doing to help support them, behind the scenes, and then relating it back to what your talk about Pushkin, and then like I said, Paul Robeson before, it's just interesting, just the connection of the resistance that Russia seems to be some sort of stalwart, if you will, against the oppression that you said that they also experienced. I don't know if that makes sense. Probably more.
Well, let me just take the first part of your question. I think was interesting. How do you present? Okay, if Pushkin is not well known, how do you make him well known? What can we do specifically to stop that? And you're quite right. One of my projects when I was doing Pushkin work maybe 10 years ago with a group of scholars from the Pushkin Center, University of Wisconsin. We were going to create this program called the Pushkin Scholars Program. And the program was going to be open to minority students to go to Russia, to study Russian, to study Pushkin, and then to go to Ukraine, and then to go to Africa. Stuff like that would be perfect. You create a scholars program, okay? Of course it costs money, but there are ways of working around that, where you give minority, quote unquote, minority students a chance as a group to study Pushkin and to travel at the same time. And that's one thing you can do. I doubt that you see any of those programs anywhere in any university in this country.
Right.
And that is exactly what's needed. The other thing is you can get individual, like we've been talking about The Negro of Peter the Great. It's a short story. It's, I don't know, maybe 60 pages long. I would love to see more students of color read that story. You can begin with that story. That is an amazing story that really expresses the kind of, racism that existed in the 17th century, and it parallels what we see today. That story is really a real eye-opener. And I think that, just that story alone, if students can just read that story in and of itself, that would do a whole lot to get them moving. And then from there, they could read other good pieces, like, for example, The Captain's Daughter, about the Pugachev slave rebellion, and the slaughter and the murder of Russians against Russians. I think students of color would take to that story very well. Also, the Gypsies. There's a story that he wrote called Gypsies. They should read that, about a Russian aristocrat, alienated by his own upper-class society, drops out and starts traveling with this gypsy group in hopes that these gypsies will give him some kind of an identity that he lacks. And what happens is he falls in love with the gypsy woman, and he kills her because she, in the process, doesn't like him anymore and starts going out or having an affair with another man. His response is to kill her. And the point of the story is that why this guy is with the gypsies is because he is cut off from contact with real people. That he doesn't like his own aristocratic society, but he doesn't understand and doesn't really care to understand the gypsy society. So he ends up killing this woman for no reason. It shows how he has been separated from himself and from his people by an intense class division that exists in Russia at the time. And it also shows how he's an outsider, and he's an outsider because he has no connections. He has no connections with himself, he has no connections with his own aristocratic community, and he has no understanding of people who are, who are common, who live with a different set of principles. Students should read that, students of color, and I think they will identify with the story if they read that story.
Actually, two points. One, the first one is I commend you for the work, your focus on Pushkin and the immense amount of work that you've done and your persistence with it. And definitely there's much to be learned from what you've done and the way in which you've proceeded. And I like the idea that it's a memoir because you're basically giving individuals a sense of how they should proceed in the world. Okay, so again, high marks for that. But I have a critique, which is
Go ahead.
sorry.
No problem.
Well, I mean, it
Go
comes
ahead.
in. It
Go
comes.
for it.
No, don't worry. It comes. It comes in multiple frames. But one, let me get at one critique by a defense. A defense of today's youth.
Okay, go ahead.
Defense of.
Yeah.
If your position leads you to ultimately feel despair about the state of youth, whether you want to say African American youth or youth in general, I would say that that's misguided. Misguided because it's not looking historically at how the world works. Now, the world is not stuck at a particular place in time. In the 1940s, people in the U.S. and probably were saying, "Oh, this is hopeless.
Yeah.
Look at how Jim Crow was destroying everything."
Yeah.
But internal to that, people were working. Individuals were working, and they were making, they were taking actions which was transformative in the long run. So that was, I mean, I think that's critical. Like, don't sort of slip into a sort of negativity because things don't seem obvious at the moment. That's one thing. But secondly, and it's a similar kind of critique, which is the presumption that it's a real major social problem, that Pushkin is not well read or is not as famous outside of Russia as you would like, is unfortunate for you because that's Pushkin is your love.
Right.
But I wouldn't then say that it's okay to lead you to a negative sense of the world. Now, there are other people who, and I'm in no way trivializing your work. I think, again, what I said at the beginning, I'm very serious about it and I hold to it. But the critiques, I think, are important to be heard, that if today's youth don't read Pushkin, I think it's their loss, but it doesn't mean that they might not ever get to read Pushkin, or other people might not read Pushkin. Or understanding of how the world works, right? So, in other words, separate Pushkin's place in the canon from an indication that the world itself is falling apart, to be totally, to exaggerate a bit. So just be careful of that. And the last point I'll make, Pushkin lived in relative isolation, if you want to talk racially, right? And that's totally different from Toussaint Louverture. I mean, in other words, it's not the same, as you can't sort of do those parallel kinds of things like Pushkin, African Americans, Pushkin. It's because they're absolutely different in terms of populations and the kinds of resources one has to rely upon to push back in the face of what's going on in the world. So I'll end there, which is to say, again, high marks, totally, you should be given all the support in the world, go, 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 but don't let it lead you towards certain kinds of negativities about youth or, I think, the world agenda. End of story.
Well, that's a good point. I want to agree with you. I really do. I would prefer to agree with you. And I would prefer to say, well, I'm wrong. I would want to say, I would really want to say I'm wrong. I don't relish being negative. I don't relish criticizing our educational system. I don't like that, and I want to be positive as possible. And yet I can't. And I can't, Right. Right.
Don't look historically, the process of history.
Yeah.
then it becomes a weight
Okay.
that, you know.
I'll give it to you there. I agree with that. I agree with that. Yeah. You know, one should not just look at the negatives. One should look at a broader picture. And I have nothing wrong. It's good. Yeah. One point I will say though is regarding Pushkin and his relationship to the African American community. I'll say this, and I say this in the book. It's easy to say that Pushkin, is a Russian icon. It's easy to say that he represents the Russian people. There are a lot of cliches about Pushkin and, his influence on Russian literature, on world culture, on, literary history. Those are all easy things to say. It's much harder to say Pushkin has a connection to African American culture. That's a very difficult thing to say, and even a harder thing to prove. And yet I'm trying to do that, and it's not easy because there's a resistance to it, and it's hard to articulate.
You can say it as he has a spiritual connection.
Well,
If you make the argument that he has a historical connection, you're going to lose. It's not going to work. But a spiritual connection, now you've got power in terms of what you're going after.
yeah, okay.
To me, the back and forth is not.
Okay.
First, it's a flawed. To me, nobody is negative. The fact we're having this event, the fact you wrote, is the most positive proposition. So the
Okay.
brother, for me, excuse me, my brother. Negativity, you introduced the negative idea, but let's go forward. In my view, it's positive. What you wrote, the writing is a positive action. And critical analysis of generations is normal. Transactional critical discussion gives momentum for generations that are firebrands that would come inevitably. Nobody's blind of that. That's why we have this event here. So for me, I think this back and forth stuff is counterproductive because it's a misunderstanding, in my view. Nobody proposed a negative idea. The fact you wrote it, the fact you presented it today, the fact we hold this event here is the most positive part of it. Now we want, as far as I'm concerned, is also a fact against all the propaganda against black history, black reconnection to, certain historical, nutritious, valued historical moments is a fact. Paul Robeson is almost non-existent. It's not only Pushkin idea. Paul Robeson, Kwame Nkrumah, Lumumba. We are now having a series of events on Lumumba to make our folks deal with nutritious idea to connect and intellectually develop. So for me, that is positive. So the idea of no one lost hope. We make movies because we believe there will be a generation coming. Even if we give up on contemporary, materialistically, digitally occupied generation, which is a fact. The digital occupation that has made our children prisoner of culture war is a fact of life. That's why we're fighting. Those of us who are doing things, we're fighting that. So to me, in fact, I'll tell you, my brother, we're going to have one more event when Howard kids come back. We're going to bring you back to make sure we also continue to struggle to get young people be captivated or get it. The other one is, in the positive proposal the sister asked you, children's book is very important to make in my view, on Pushkin. It would be an amazing, we have Toussaint Louverture children's book that actually sells very well. So I think, I don't know, I don't want to put it on you because I don't like people assigning us. You just took years to do your project. I don't want to give you a new project, but I think we need to propose to your printer, your publisher, Kasaun, a children's book with pictures, etc. That's how we should go forward. And I think this lady wants to talk.
Okay, good point, good point, yeah, great.
First of all, I want to say thank you for giving this event and like showing your book. I'm coming to this from the perspective of having been, I was a Russian major in college and also fell in love with the place for better or for worse, and have found no way to make space for it in my life, being here in the US. And I so appreciate the way that you've made this connection with Pushkin. And like it's a very personal connection for you, but also noting the actual like relationship that other artists have had with him here, other like African American artists have had with him here. And I think that's so important to highlight. I did not know like any of this. Like I only know of Pushkin as like, oh, he's the Shakespeare of Russian literature. And I guess throughout this discussion, it's gotten me thinking a lot more. I did not realize actually maybe how much that the communist revolution and Soviet literature pushed him up in this space more so. Like I don't know the difference between how he was perceived in the late 1800s versus after the revolution. And I was wondering if you have like experience with, like you mentioned going to Russia a few times, but did you, well, it's weird to say, did you go to the Soviet Union or not? Because so many people, like even if they're not in the Soviet Union anymore, like that's where they grew up and that's where they worked, and like, so it's a new like system change, but still retains like much of the same character because it's the same people. So I was wondering if you could also maybe speak a little bit about your experience with the Soviet relationship with Pushkin and how that also relates to your finding of him.
Wow. Yeah, you know, one thing I noticed, and I bring this out at the beginning of my book because I wanted to see how Pushkin was perceived. I think I went first to Russia, late 90s, early 2000s. And by the way, you know, there's a difference between Russia and the Soviet Union. One should not conflate Russia with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, I guess, fell in 1991, but Russia didn't fall. Russia remained. So the two are not the same thing. When I was there, the Soviet Union had collapsed. And because of that collapse, there was disarray in the society. You know, definite disarray. I doubt if that disarray is still there now. But to answer your question, one thing I did notice is that Pushkin, in terms of you know, bookstores, portraits, art galleries where you can go and see portraits of Pushkin, outside of V.I. Lenin, Pushkin is the most popular figure just in terms of popular culture in the Russian society today. That amazed me. I didn't expect to see that. But he is enormously popular still in Russia. You go to portrait painters in the museums, private, you know, collections, private galleries. You see numerous pictures of Pushkin, you know, with African features. So he still plays a very big role in Russian society that I could see. You know, again, that was one of the positive things that I took in going to Russia. And when you talk to people on the street or in the street, They know his poems by heart. They know who he is. He's a figure that is everywhere, wherever you go. And I experienced that, and that was, important to me, to discover that, I was not alone, that Russian people still have a strong view of him. They still, hold him with dearness. I don't know if that answers your question, but I can say that.
And I just want to ask you while you're at it, the Ethiopian issue, the connection, Ethiopian, now you added Eritrean today. This is the first time I'm hearing Eritrea, which is fine with me. But also Cameroon and Chad.
Yes.
Where are you on this? Where do you fall on in terms?
Yeah,
of,
that's a big controversy. Ganamanku says that, Pushkin's great-grandfather came from Chad. Hugh Barnes, who wrote that book about his great father called Stolen Prince, said he came from Cameroon. This Eritrean friend of mine, I've discussed with him, he says, no, he's from Eritrea. He came from, we have a statue of Pushkin in our capital. His relatives still live here. So the debate is still ongoing. And to be honest, the establishment all adhere to Ganamanku. They're all saying now, yes, Pushkin came from Chad. He's not from Ethiopia. He's not from Eritrea. He's not from Cameroon. But that's the current point of view. My position is it's still up in the air. There's no definitive evidence from where he came, despite what they're saying today, that he came from Chad. And I'm open on that. I'm not going to close the door on that until I see more evidence, I see more discussion. I don't know where he came from, and I'm not going to say where he came from, despite what the establishment critics say. If that answers the question.
It's more or less a comment. I am agreeing with your statement that Western education is broken, it's not making any sense anymore, that the students are sort of leaderless because of the brokenness of the Western education. I think that is a right statement as far as I'm concerned, because Western education is based mostly on falsehood, on half-baked ideas, and on denial of the existence of black civilization, all the contributions made by their fathers who are Africans, and so on. So when there is this brokenness that we see of the black,
It works. It works.
or the lack of clear education at this time, is because the time demands the emergence of the truth. And the truth is about the truth lies on the preeminence of African people, African civilization, the origination of human civilization, or even human beings. Black people. So until and unless this truth is replacing the void, there's no movement forward. This is my comment. And
Yeah.
your attempt to introduce Pushkin into the scene is one of the attempts, and great attempts, to fill in the blank. This struggle has been going on in a very low status, let's say, because there hasn't been much of help to promote this. We've been made fearful of ourselves, of our potentials. Our efforts are we're not getting any prominence, and therefore we cannot promote ourselves, our education, our history. We don't tell our stories confidently, and that's why there is a lack of enough African Americans or Black people to study in depth about Pushkin and all the African heroes that we need to know.
Yeah. Well, my answer to you is you're quite right, but from this talk tonight, I feel what needs to be said is this forum tonight, we want to make a step. This is a step in the right direction to have this kind of discussion, to have more discussions like this. I have a friend who's an economist. He's from Jamaica, and he agrees about the lack of education and how African students need certain, information. So what he's doing is he's putting together a list of books on economics. He's from Jamaica, and he's going to send those books to Jamaica College so that students in Jamaica can get, an education on economics. There are ways, there are things we can do to create the educational environment that we don't have. Sankova Cafe, what the programs that it has is doing something, to help that situation. And so there's no reason to despair. If it's not there, then you do something to make it. If there's no African history, if there's no education, then you do things to create it. My friend is collecting books on economics from various different authors. We're going to put them in boxes and send them off to this Jamaican college so students can be introduced to these ideas. You see, there are things to do. There are ways to create an educational framework so that the youth can and will be introduced to Pushkin, to economics, to African history. So it can be done. And there's the positiveness I think I found in this discussion. So, yeah.
Last question.
I just want to say thank you for what you have done. And I just want to ask, Pushkin, Hegel, and Dumas were in the same time frame.
Yes.
Never had any connection as such. But at the end of the day, what Hegel, this is the Eurocentric philosophy that he spread, basically has made it, whether it's economic or racist issues, has facilitated to what exists now. And I just want to know if you have got into that and see, how the influence of Hegel, even at this point, we are seeing it on our streets. We are seeing it now. And professor from Temple University, Charlotte Rowe, with Hegel and the Third World. And it's very fascinating how the whole debate of racism has started through that and has kind of through the colonial time and all that. We haven't skipped that yet. And obviously Pushkin has got that through it. And have you, researched that part of
Yeah. I have to confess, I don't know Hegel that well. I know he was the inventor of that concept, the other, but I don't know Hegel. All I know is that Marx sort of read Hegel in his early years, but I don't know Hegel. I really don't know him, so I can't pretend to answer your question on that. Pushkin, by the way, people say, well, Pushkin is intellectually superficial. That's far from the truth. He had studied the French, historians who were just beginning to talk about class conflict. People like Auguste Thierry and Francois Guizot. He had those books in his library, and he had read those French historians. Now, I didn't see any references to Hegel, but I know he was reading French historians who were rewriting and reworking the whole concept of history. And Pushkin had a very firm and strong historical understanding from these texts that he had read. But again, I didn't see any direct references to Hegel, but I saw references to these other writers.
Family, please give it up for Dr. Coles.
Thank you. Thanks for everyone coming out. Thank you.
Thank you. So copies of the book are on the way. If you'd like to pre-order a signed copy, you can come talk to us in the back, and we'll get you one of these book plates, which we'll have Dr. Coles sign today. Looking forward to the next event as well. And you can also order the book anytime at stkofa.com. That goes for people online as well. And also just wanted to briefly mention, as we close, 2 events that we have coming up this week. One is Gaza on Our Mind, our bi-weekly community gathering. This Sunday is Gaza on Our Mind, which is an event where we bring together artists and scholars and people to come together and really try to understand these issues, empathize through art. And so we do Gaza on Our Mind, Congo on Our Mind, Sudan on Our Mind, and Haiti on Our Mind every other week. Our intention is to deeply interrogate these conflicts and their origins. We also have on Thursday, we have an event that's celebrating the Sankofa Archive. The Sankofa Archive Group has been working very hard this summer to document the work of Haile and Sharik over the course of their careers. And so this will be an event where that team will be exhibiting some of the work, talking about the work they did this summer. It's going to be a really incredible event. So again, if you'd like to pre-order a copy of the book, you can do so in the back with us now. You can also order it anytime on stkofa.com. Thank you very much for being here. Have a great night.
Thank you, Troy. I enjoyed this, and I'm glad to have come. It certainly resurrects my own sort of,